Hi, I'm Saxa Mullins and I'm a survivor. Tonight we're here to talk about sexual violence and consent. In 2013, I was assaulted in Sydney's King's Cross. My search for justice ended after 2 trials, 2 appeals, an acquittal and no resolution for me. Coming out of a 4-year ordeal with no closure left me feeling dejected, untethered and determined to tell my story. I did not give consent, but the court found there was the mistaken belief that consent was given. I was labelled an unreliable witness to my own story. My case triggered a landmark review of sexual assault laws and reignited an ongoing conversation. The momentum we're seeing right now brings me hope that real, lasting change will come from this and that survivors will no longer have to lay their trauma bare to be heard. Welcome to Q&A.
Hi there and welcome to the program. Tonight we're bringing you an important conversation with many voices. In the room tonight we have survivors, students, parents, educators and experts. And for her brilliant opening of the show, would you please give a round of applause to Saxa Mullins. Saxon is going to be joining the conversation a little later on, and joining me on the panel tonight, broadcaster and author Yumi Stynes, who's about to publish a book on consent. Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of New South Wales, Michael Salter. Principal of Sydney's Wenona School, Dr Briony Scott. Former NRL player and mental health advocate, Joe Williams. And 2021's Youth Influencer of the Year, among many other things, Yasmin Poole. Please make all of them feel welcome. You can stream us live on iView and all the socials, of course, and you can join the conversation on Instagram and Twitter. Quanda is the hashtag. Please do keep it respectful. Our first question tonight comes from Sophie McDonald.
Police Commissioner Michael Fuller, in my home state today, announced a proposed app to register consent. Michael Salter, do you think that this will help achieve higher rates of sexual assault convictions, or is it actually just circling around the problem without actually targeting it?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, this was a tough one from the Commissioner, and I'm not sure that this start-up is probably going to fly. You know, consent is a really complex issue. It is a complex process. It is not obviously ticking a box. It's not swiping left on an app. And I think, as you know, the Commissioner's intentions were obviously good, and he sort of went on to emphasise the importance of positive consent and affirmative consent, where we take action in order to obtain consent from a partner. But, you know, no, consent is not just a procedural, legal tick box exercise. It's something that we need to really think about very carefully.
Yumi?
It stinks. I mean, it's a terrible idea. And anybody who's ever been assaulted or has even been sort of edged and pushed into something knows this is a bad idea. If you can be coerced into sex, you can easily be coerced into ticking a box or swiping on an app. In
Denmark, though, they do have an app called I Consent. They've also got laws there requiring provable, explicit consent before a sexual act. And similar laws in Sweden have actually led to an increase, a 75% increase in rape convictions. Is it that stupid an idea?
I think it seems to be squashing down the conversation about how consent needs to be ongoing. So by kind of intimating that you can swipe and then that's solved and then you can go ahead and it's a free-for-all, that's a pretty dangerous idea, because you need to keep checking in with people saying, is this okay? Things might change from what you expected, or you might change yourself and go, you know what, I'm not into it anymore. And if it's there, provable, then you might feel like, oh, God, I've signed my life away.
I'm stuck with this. Yasmin, how did you receive that suggestion from a police commissioner?
I think there's this thing with, to be honest, leaders, when they seem to see big issues. We saw the COVID Safe app, and now we're seeing an app proposed for something as serious as rape and sexual assault. And, you know, clearly his intentions were good, but this is an example of why we should be centering and listening to survivors, and also using evidence-based approach, because this is too serious for us to suddenly throw ideas at a wall and hope that it sticks. So, you know, there's so many issues with this app that I can't even begin. The first is, you know, what if somebody's intoxicated intoxicated? What if there's a power imbalance? So ultimately, again, it's let's centre the lived experience of survivors and ensure that we're actually following the evidence. This is not the time to make up new ideas.
I want to bring in Vince Hurley here. You've been a cop on the beat for some 30 years in the same state. What did you make of a police commissioner suggesting something like this?
I think the overriding importance for me was that A, he's engaged in the conversation, and B, it keeps the conversation going. If it saves one rape, it served its purpose. I can't say I'm cynical about it, although I do have reservations about it, but overall, the fact that he's raised it and keeps the conversation going, to me, is more important than anything else at this point in time. And consent is a horrendously difficult, subject and topic, and you don't want the app to distract from the issue of yes or no consent. But overall, to me, as long as it keeps the conversation going and alive in the public domain, that's more important to me.
Joe Williams, if it could save one assault, one rape.
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? Obviously saving one person, one person who's in danger from, something that's been horrific, then, it can be seen as a positive for me. I just can't wear the fact that we're talking about ticking a box yes and no when it comes down to rape and sexual assault by a phone app. I really struggle with that, to even think to sit down with my 14, 15-year-old daughter and say, hey, listen, make sure you tick yes or no. Like, it's not a... I can't wear it.
Briony Scott?
I want to encourage the police to keep on with the conversation. I disagree with him when he said that this was starting the conversation. The conversation's now been going for some time. I'm delighted they've joined in. It is a very black and white response to an incredibly complex issue, which actually is around it should be enough that a woman or a man who's being assaulted says it without having to go to an app as some kind of a proof or a way of protecting the person who has initiated the sex. So I think they've got a long way to go, but we need the police. We need them to engage, and what that just says to me is they're not going to learn by being shamed and ridiculed on social media. It means that we have a lot more education to do.
My fear with this as well is that it actually might protect men. Can you imagine the barriers that are already facing young women in establishing sexual assault and rape, let alone if you are coerced into agreeing to this app? So it might actually produce the counter effect, again, that we need to centre survivors in this conversation.
Let's take our next question. It comes from Isabella Polgar.
This is to all the panellists. What age should consent training take place? And is there such thing as being too young for consent training?
Briony.
Consent training, I think, starts right from the beginning. So from 1, 2, 3, learning that your body is yours, that you don't impose or take over a child, their actions. I think it starts really young. Now, it's not obviously all around sex. There's a lot of different ways that consent plays out with a person. And it has to be age appropriate, but most people are very capable of educating around that, really from a very young age.
But when do you actually start teaching? When do your school...
Kindergarten.
But specifically consent around sex?
No.
When does
consent
that happen?
in kindergarten starts around, from my head to my toes, I say what goes. So you start that. And then you work your way through primary school. So around about year 4, year 5, year 6, it's your body. You get to say so they're becoming quite explicit around what anyone can do to you. And then it's pretty much full on from there. It depends a lot on where the child is at as to how much they're hearing and how much they want to hear. But the actual thing through the curriculum is from a very early age.
OK. Michael, do you think that there is a clear age that you can set for the introduction of the really detailed consent conversations?
I think it just comes down to age appropriateness and also what kids need, and we need to be listening to what kids need. Not only so that they can, we can set the foundations for healthy and respectful relationships, but also to protect kids. We often try to withhold, the difficult realities of life from kids, and sometimes that means we try and withhold information about sexual matters. But frankly, there are offenders out there that don't have, those reservations.
I'm just trying to get a bit more specific than age appropriate, because we obviously in Australia we all know that there are objections raised to things like safe schools. Some people believe that you're sort of sexualising young people too early by introducing complex themes. When is it right to be having this conversation about the specifics of sexual consent?
Well, to be really frank, you know, I'm a criminologist, I work in child sexual abuse, and kids get sexually assaulted. And if we don't give them the words that they need, and if we don't give them the boundaries that they need in order to talk about things that might be happening that are crossing those boundaries, then we're leaving kids vulnerable. And I understand that that makes parents uncomfortable. I understand that makes some communities uncomfortable, but that is just a fact of life. And if we don't arm kids with knowledge that empowers them to keep themselves safe, then we're putting them at risk. And, you know, the consent conversation is part of that, and it lays the foundation for healthy relationships into the future.
So Briony, how do you balance then the parents and the community groups that say, actually, this child is 7 or is 8, and it's too soon for you to be talking to them about the heavy detail? With the need for
there are constraints, and parents ultimately overrule school. So we are allowed to teach what's in the curriculum, and we obviously have to teach what's in the New South Wales curriculum. But ultimately, if a parent is there going, and we run extra sex classes or relationship classes in years 5 and 6, if a parent goes, I don't want the school explaining that or talking about that, then the parents get to overrule the school.
And what, the kid gets pulled out or what?
Yeah, they just don't go. They don't go to that part of it. It is absolutely, the parents have the right to raise their child the way they see fit. So we have to comply with the New South Wales curriculum. Beyond that, it is absolutely up to a parent to decide.
Joe?
I struggle with one lesson, even I think before the consent conversation, is that we're going to start teaching kids, obviously from a younger age than when they go to school, about respect. And the actual conversation around consent and yes and no comes back to, well, I respect somebody's view in how they feel and what they, you know, the respect of somebody's own voice.
Aren't all kids taught respect at school?
Aren't they?
You've got kids.
Yeah, I most definitely do, but like I think the conversation's got to start a hell of a lot long before they go to school. We can't place these type of conversations, and I was speaking off air about it, is that I know with my kids that I'm going to have more intimate conversations with my kids than a teacher can ever have, because I know my kids, I know their persona, I know everything about my kids. So we need to get to the point, I believe, that parents are starting to educate their kids around respectful conversations and are about respect for other people.
Yumi, how do you do this with your kids?
So Dr Melissa Kang, who's here, Dolly Doctor, and I wrote a book about consent, and we agonised over the age level and how to kind of lay it in stone, which is kind of what you're asking now. Please give me a set age when we can have this conversation. The beauty of kids, because I do have 4 of my own, is that if it's too graphic or gross or just too adult, they do just tune out. And I think people are so worried about the danger of giving them too much information. Information is a gift, and that is the gift that parents should be giving their kids. If it's too much, they apply their own filters, they censor it themselves. And I think we've got to get in there with the conversations before the puberty hormones start mucking with their brains.
But you talk to the little ones about things like tickling,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
Just explain that.
So, well, tickling's a great example because it's touch, it's intimate, it's fun, just like sex. And it's usually done between people who know each other, which is like sex as well. And there's always a point with a kid where they start to go, I'm kind of hating this. I'm terrified. I'm going to vomit. I'm going to pee myself. And they want to call stop, but a lot of their body language is confusing because they also seem to be enjoying themselves. So in those instances, that's a really good opportunity for the people who are doing the tickling, which is generally a carer or an older person, to say, do you want me to stop? And then realise that the kid actually has agency over their body, and if they say stop, you'll listen. Another thing that you can do is apply a safe word, which seems so adult because it's a BDSM kind of term, but it's really useful and kids are into it. So with mine, we say eggplant or pineapple. And if I'm tickling them, they might shout stop, 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 but they're doing it, and I think that they might want to keep going. So if they say pineapple, I know for sure that that's a timeout. Yeah. And a safe word conversation in a sexual context is really good because it means that at the start of an intimate encounter, you're already talking about consent and setting something up that gives you an escape hatch.
Yasmin, do you remember how old you were when at school the serious bits of these conversations started to happen? Did you have them?
I was never taught about consent. I did receive sex education around year 11, but I remember even vividly at 14 years old being made to feel uncomfortable. And my response to that in my head, and I remember it, I said, boys will be boys. And I repeated it to myself, boys be boys, boys be boys. And I don't know where I got that from. I didn't get it from my parents. I didn't get it from the school. I didn't get it from my peers. But somehow I needed something to justify me feeling uncomfortable. And I didn't know what to do with that. So I certainly think it needs to happen earlier. But I also think there's a nuanced and deeper conversation that it isn't just about consent, it's about power. And we need to also be teaching our kids about power. Because I was reading Chanel's petition to call for consent education at a younger age. Young girls were sharing how they woke up mid-rape, you know, and they'd wake up and notice that their underwear was stained with blood, right? That's happening right now to young women in Australia. So yes, let's teach consent, but let's also encourage young men to reflect upon that sense of entitlement, of power, of the way that women's position in society is often reduced. You know, what triggers that as well? So there's also a deeper conversation here about, I guess, structural inequality that we also need to have.
And we are going to get to that conversation about power structures during the program tonight. We've had loads of amazing questions from people right across the country this week relating to some of the complexities of navigating these intimate situations. We're going to take a couple of them. Sylvia Chen, what's your question?
Yeah, what if the girl says yes before sex, but then she regretted and refused to continue during the sexual process? Will this be classified as consent or dissent?
So what happens if during the sexual act
she feels uncomfortable
and she changes? Yasmin?
I mean, it's not consent. The whole point is that it's a process, and any person, you know, man, woman or anybody, is able to say no. Sex shouldn't be about doing the complete act. There should be no obligation, in fact, to do any of that act. So absolutely, that is not consent. You know, you have every right at any point to say no, full stop.
It's a great question, but it's not modelled, so we don't see that in porn, we don't see it in movies, in rom-coms, where somebody's kind of agreed to go through with something and then halfway through they're very much allowed to change their mind, but it's a really tricky thing to do in real life because you're like, well, I'm here, my pants are down. How do I actually say it out loud? And it's almost like a muscle that you need to exercise. When we're not given many people modelling that, then it becomes even harder.
Can you just take me back to when you were 15? I think you call it your swoony stage, and a particular incident that you've been thinking about recently.
Yeah, so I've written a whole book about consent, and this did not occur to me the entire 2 years. I was 15. I was a very inexperienced 15-year-old, so I wasn't particularly adventurous, except in my mind. And I was lucky enough to convince a guy to kiss me in the back of a paddock at a party.
And you really liked this guy?
Yeah, well, I didn't really know him, but I thought he was cute, and that was enough, you know. So we're out there in the back. My friends don't know where I am. I'm completely okay, and he's kissing me and kissing my neck, and I'm starting to, like, I'm loving it, sick, and my eyes are rolling back in my head, and it's really good. And then next minute, his penis is at my mouth. So I was really surprised. I've never done that before, and I communicated non-consent verbally and physically. And then we resumed making out. And I was back into loving it, sick, and he's kissing my neck. And then the penis arrives at my mouth again. So this is an incident that was a non-consensual, technically an assault, but at the time I didn't even really rate it as a thing.
And you didn't have the language?
I didn't have the language. I never mentioned it to my friends. I never even mentioned it until 2 days ago.
Michael, how important is it for us as a society in kind of dealing with this to teach young men to deal with this is not okay? Because there's a whole ego thing and a young male psychology going on there, isn't there?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think that's absolutely the case. And, you know, we can think about those teen years, you know, the relations between boys can be, you know, the shape of them can be quite hostile, really misogynist between boys in terms of the type of banter and the type of culture. And actually a lot of pressure on boys to engage in sexual acts, not for sexual pleasure, but essentially to prove themselves to themselves and to their mates. And, you know, we see young boys crossing boundaries in exactly the way that Yumi's just outlined. And partly because he's anxious, he's worried, there's all sorts of things going on. And then there's the additional violation after these acts where they go back and tell their friends. You know, and right across the country, you know, so many women have these stories, you know, that occurred in their teen years, in their adult years, where these boundaries are violated, and it's become a normal part of the culture.
So does that mean then that these conversations around consent actually have to be a bit more sophisticated? We've got to understand what's going on for these groups of young men, potentially?
Yeah, and I think we really struggle, you know, I think adult men really struggle to have honest conversations with teenage boys, about honest conversations about sex, sexuality, rejection, humiliation, you know, things that are just part and parcel of sexual negotiation. And, you know, men and boys are really intolerant of being rejected and of feeling shamed.
Do you think that's true, Joe?
Yeah, we were having a discussion about this earlier. It was the fact that I believe, and we said that men really struggle to have these deep and honest conversations with our boys. I think we need to get to a point where we're having these deep and honest conversations, otherwise we're going to continue on the path that we've been on. Change only happens when we start to dive into the deep stuff and really... the uncomfortable stuff, I always talk about getting a little bit closer to the things that make you a little bit uncomfortable mentally. Because that's when you find out why you're uncomfortable about it. And then when those sort of things arise, especially around conversations with kids, I've had some challenging conversations.
You've been a footy player. I mean, the sort of culture of these spaces...
That was my job, you know, like for me...
But I'm just wondering how we actually make these changes that Michael's talking about. How do you teach young blokes that are, you know, elite sports people or at sort of private schools or whatever, to be okay with rejection, to sit with the hurt of maybe someone saying, hey, I'm not into that?
I think it starts in the family home. It starts in the family home and how we educate and then raise strong young men to be able to sit in that uncomfortable space, to be able to call out especially bad behaviours, but also feel confident enough to be able to have those conversations in front of their mates as well.
And can I also just add, there's the importance of actually the men or, you know, whoever, it's not the onus is just on somebody to say, hey, I'm uncomfortable. You know, throughout the process, you should be saying, is this okay? Is this all right? It shouldn't always just be about, let's say it's a woman that feels super uncomfortable. So, you know, when we talk about pornography and like you were saying, consent is not something that appears when we, you know, when you view it. So it's also educating that process of taking the step forward to actually be vulnerable to ask, is this okay? Am I doing all right? Is that fine? That's also something that we need to push for.
OK, I want to take a question from Gabriel Briony. What's your question for the panel?
So there's this growing idea that the only means of achieving consent is verbally, which I see a couple of problems with. One is the word someone chooses to use doesn't necessarily reflect how they feel. Like you can get a yes out of somebody when they actually would like to say no. And the other is that it seems to me there is enthusiastic consent, which seems totally viable as well. So I was curious to ask the panellists, how would they recommend effectively going about achieving consent?
You're talking about non-verbal consent there? Yeah. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, enthusiastic consent.
OK, Briony, you tackle that.
Thank you. I was just listening to the conversation about the men too, and I think, you know, it's not like women or girls are born sexually mature and knowing how to do this either. I mean, everyone is learning, and it's having the ground rules underneath that, which goes to your concept of respect and understanding that actually girls are going to make mistakes and they can objectify boys just as much as boys can objectify girls. You know, there can be virginity clubs, then you join the club and you leave it once you've lost your virginity, and there's a lot of ways that we can cheapen the experience across the board. And so it comes to, and this partly answers your question as well, around how do you teach around sexual negotiation? How do you learn that you will make mistakes, and learning how to actually own those mistakes and to apologise and to genuinely make amends when that happens. And sexual negotiation is not just verbal at all. There's 1,000 ways you can communicate messages, and being honest and open about those. The ego thing, that's not just a male thing. Women have egos too. And so we're really coming down to human nature and how we treat each other as fellow humans that are of equal worth, regardless of who you are and your sexuality.
Do you think, though, Michael, we're entering a space, as we have these conversations, where non-verbal consent is becoming harder for people to navigate?
I mean, we need to think about consent on a spectrum, and we often talk about verbal consent, but particularly for young people, because often the sex they might be having is casual sex. And so it's a stranger. I mean, you can't rely on non-verbal cues with someone that you don't know. It's then actually quite difficult to have, you know, conversations, explicit conversations about sex with someone you've never met before, but that's what you need to do when it comes to a first-time partner. You know, for you know, longer-term sexual relationships, then of course we see a segue into non-verbal cues, because you essentially have agreements. You have, people that you know, that you understand, and so on. But the onus really is, especially in the casual encounter, the onus is to be very clear, and particularly where alcohol or other substances are involved and assumptions can be made. And that's where we see a lot go wrong for young people.
We've got a motto, Gabriel. Ask, listen and observe. So you ask the person if they're into it and you continue to ask. You listen to their answer, because sometimes they might be saying, yeah, and it's clearly a yes, but it's not a clear yes. And observe. So observing is all about the non-verbal cues, and they occur the entire time. So you keep a cycle of ask, listen, observe. If you would like to communicate non-verbally, say if, for instance, you prefer to use sign language, or you have a language difference, then you may need to have an opening sort of conversation about, okay, this means stop, or I'm going to call time out if I'm not loving this, in which case you can keep going in a non-verbal way.
Yasmin, the Australian of the Year, Grace Tame, has pointed out repeatedly that across the different jurisdictions of Australia, there are different definitions, different legal definitions of consent. Do you think young people are even aware? I mean, I wasn't aware of that prior to this year.
No, I don't think that they're aware of it, but I do think that it's nonetheless extremely important that I think even on the base level that the legal system can get this right. And as Grace emphasises, if we're going to be understanding consent, even on a legal level, there needs to be some uniformity. And even if we see the treatment of the legal systems, the way that they treat sexual assault and the rape. And to be honest, the treatment of survivors is still pretty appalling at points. So even though young people might not be explicitly reading the law, it's still just as important in terms of societal messaging and really, I guess, shaping the conversation on a ground level.
I mean, you move between different parts of Australia. Are you aware of the different definitions in the different places?
I wasn't aware, no. So it's again, it's part of a wider issue that why haven't we actually consulted with survivors about these kind of barriers? But, I was speaking to even lawyers about this, and it goes beyond black letter law. It's also, again, how the legal system treats survivors, the way that they handle evidence. Are we putting the burden on the person that is, accusing of rape? Are we suddenly, how are we characterising, how are we supporting them so that they feel supported during that process? So I think the conversation even about, sexual assault and rape, separate courts, just changing that system, that's also an important conversation to have.
I want to bring Saxon Mullins in on this conversation. How do you observe the conversation that's taking place tonight?
Oh, I mean, I love all conversations about consent. But no, yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that the laws, while we may not be, necessarily really aware of them, it does all flow on. Like consent is not just one thing we can change. So, if we change it in schools or the law, we need to change it everywhere. But also how we talk about sex, I think really inhibits our ability to have those frank conversations. For example, like we were saying before, people view sex as like an end destination. You get on here and you have to, pardon the pun, get off here. And, what it's really about is two people having a good time, enjoying each other. And I think that's what makes the consent conversations easier. If you're just there to have a good time with somebody, you will naturally be like, oh, do you enjoy that? How about we do this? Oh, that feels really good. You will have those open conversations because that's what you're there for.
Right. Thank you. Let's take our next question tonight. And I should just actually say that if any of this conversation raises issues for you, you can contact 1800-RESPECT or Lifeline. Those numbers both on your screen right now. You can also contact the Kids Helpline. That number is up on your screen as well. Well, let's take a video question from Ingrid Irwin in Ballarat.
With just a 1% conviction rate in sexual assault matters that are reported to police, why is it that we keep encouraging survivors to come forward and report to police when really the price they pay is loss of family, friends, career, finances, your mental and physical health, too often deteriorating into self-harm and suicide?
Yasmin.
I mean, I completely agree that the answer to somebody coming forward shouldn't just be, well, why didn't you take it to the courts, or why didn't you go to the police? There are a myriad of reasons, and I don't want to speak for survivors, but a myriad of reasons. You know, I think the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse found that it was, you know, decades before often survivors would actually come forward. So again, I think it's something that Grace Tame was emphasising was when she stepped forward, you know, it was teachers that came forward and said, we hear you, we stand with you. It was her peers that said, how can I help, but know that I'm with you always. So when it comes to the legal system, that's a whole other kettle of fish, but it's about how the community actually responds, hears and listens to survivors. And, you know, even if we look at what's happening with Parliament right now, that's a clear example of what not to do. We actually need to sit and listen and try to be there as much as we can.
Yeah, Michael, from your point of view, why are we encouraging survivors to come forward when we know what happens to them if and when they do?
I mean, I want to be clear, I have nothing but respect for survivors that report to police. I think it's an incredibly brave thing to do. And only 10% of sexual assault survivors do go to the police, because 90% of people who are sexually assaulted, frankly, they do not trust that they will be well treated. And that suspicion is well placed. We know that engagement with law enforcement can be really difficult, although I think there's been improvements over the last 10 years. But the prosecution process is absolutely brutal. It is absolutely brutal. There's no question about that. And there is a tremendous amount of work that we need to do to reform the criminal justice system so that it is legitimately delivering justice for survivors, and that is not the case at the moment.
Do you have a view as to how we can do that? Let's talk solutions.
Look, I think the point that Yasmin raised is absolutely correct. I think we need, if not specialist courts, then we need, you know, police, prosecutors, everyone involved in the criminal justice system needs to be trauma-informed. They need specialist training. And there are options for law reform as well, so that actually, you know, we can increase the likelihood of prosecution without in any way, you know, abrogating the rights of the accused.
Vince, I want to bring Vince back in. Over 30 years, you must have encountered many, many cases. From your point of view, why is this such a failing system in terms of individuals seeking justice?
Have you got a week?
No.
It's a brutal process, it is. And I would have lost count the number of times that I sat in on interviews with offenders or interviewed offenders for rape. I would have lost count. Gosh. I'd look at it from a different perspective, and Saxon may or may not agree with me because I have never been in her shoes. I've been on the other end. But I view it as that the victim is far better than the criminal. Is far stronger and far braver than the dirtbag that committed that sexual assault, that scumbag that they need to pay for their crime. And I think that as a former police officer, that it is hard to balance the views and the respect of a victim, because every victim is different. I had a 14-year-old girl who was abducted at St Mary's when I was at St Mary's Detectives, raped in the back of a panel van, and she was the most stoic individual over 2 years that led to the conviction of the two men. Yet in other cases, you have a 30 or 40-year-old woman who can't cope generally with the situation. So there's different thresholds of...
As a cop trying to sort of help people pursue justice and enforce justice, did you feel whilst in service that you failed?
Oh, look, yeah, absolutely, because you're there. Look, there are excellent... People might not agree, but there are excellent police officers there. There are excellent people in corrections. There are excellent people in probation and parole, and attorney generals and the witness support and the NGOs who are all there trying to do their very best for the victims. But the reality is, at the end of the day, as Saxon well knows, you are sitting in that witness box alone and your reputation is being carved up, and I hate to say it, but there's only two types of justice, those that can afford it and those that can't. And if you get a barrister or solicitor who is very good, they will degrade you and cut you to shreds and make you look like you are the liar, when in actual fact, you're not. So how do you get around that? At the end of the day, I don't think that whatever process is in place, because there are drug courts that deal with just with drugs, but at the end of the day, the victim's going to have to get in the witness box and give them evidence, and you can prepare that victim, as I used to do and a lot of my friends, take them into the court beforehand, explain the process, explain the legal jargon, but once they're in their witness box, they're on their own, and there's absolutely nothing you can do sitting back at the court going, oh my God, this poor individual's been carved up, and we have done our very best to try and get them through the process. But I agree, it's brutal.
Saxon, you now work in advocacy. Do you tell people when they come forward, yes, it's worth reporting, yes, go through this process?
I do get that question a lot. And it is I guess I try and gauge how that survivor is feeling. It's really personal to every survivor what they see as justice. You know, some people might not even consider going to the police or going through the court system. So, you know, that's totally off the table from the word go. But it's really about judging what each survivor feels is justice. But if someone asks me, is it worth going through the policing process, the court process, I don't know that I can be a massive advocate for it because, like you said, it's a brutal system. I think if we implement some of those changes that Michael was talking about, that will go some of the way to helping it. But we need a full-scale reform of all of those responses.
Just as an individual, I think most people can never know what you went through. How close does it come to breaking you?
I don't think it comes close. I think it just does.
I'm really very sorry to hear that, Saxon. Thank you for sharing with us tonight. We really appreciate it. Let's move on to something slightly different. Sumed Kundu's got a question about schools.
Hi. So the events of the past few weeks have been concerning to me as a high school student. And coming from a boys' high school, I've seen firsthand the patriarchal and elitist attitude that can be formed in such environments. In my opinion, boys would be able to communicate better with women and girls in a co-ed environment. So is there really a need for single-sex schools in the 21st century, and what role do they have to play in consent?
Do you think there's a role for them?
I think they do. But it's a very limited role.
Yeah, OK. Briony, Scott, you run...
Didn't see this one coming.
A single-sex school.
Firstly, I just want to say to Saxon, it's amazing to listen to the strength with which you tell your testimony. And I deal with peer-on-peer assault at the young level. And, you know, at that level, your main goal is to triage and make sure that people are actually OK and they're going to live, right? Because young people tend to go very black and white. And all, you know, and it's like my life is over, and we are there going, there is always a third way. There is always, it's never yes or no. It's always we will look after you. And so you're not always looking to get them into the court system. You're looking to keep them alive. And if they're 14, they may not at that point be able to do anything or want to do anything, but at 24 they may. And so you want to be able to strengthen them so they get to 24 and they think about it again. And at 34, they might be thinking differently, and 44 again. But the whole Me Too movement, where you're seeing women in their 30s and 40s and 50s going, it's enough. What we're trying to do is get them early so they don't have to go through their entire life carrying this burden alone. It's an extraordinary strength.
To Kundu's question...
I'm going to defend my school because it's a raging feminist boot camp. And so all of these issues that we're talking about, we talk domestic violence, we talk about power. What do you do when your boss puts his hand on your knee? How do you ask for a pay rise? What do you do when someone's throwing a temper tantrum at you? What do you do if you're cornered in the back room?
Let's get real. He's talking about boys' schools here. This is what he's talking about.
The interesting thing is it all depends on the leadership, right? So you can have people in co-ed, and it's a co-ed world, right? And how is that working for all of us? We all need to step up here, and we can look at communities and go, oh, that particular school's really bad, or this particular, you know. And I'm like, no, we just stop. We have a problem. We have a real problem across our society. And the question now is, what are the leaders doing about it? So the leaders of schools, the leaders of sporting groups, the leaders of our national government, you know, what are they doing? And I can tell you the testimony of young people is just dismissed. So you can have 2 alleged allegations of rape, both one historical and one not, in National Parliament, and there's a review within 2 days. We can have 1,500, 2,500, 3,000, 4,000 testimonies of adolescents, and we're still waiting for some demonstrable evidence of action. So
what's the action you want?
Oh, you want to know?
Yeah.
OK. So, first thing I want is I need the adults to stop acting like children so that the children don't have to keep acting like adults. Because at the moment, it's being driven by young people. First thing. The second thing I want is the Australian Human Rights Commission to come in and look at adolescents across the board. I don't care where they go to school. I don't care how much alcohol they drank. I don't care what postcode they lived in. I want them to come up with specific recommendations that I think we should implement. And I don't mean this so disrespectfully to government, although it may come across this way. I don't want to wait for them to make a decision as to whether they'll implement recommendations or not. I think the responsibility is on adults in our society to step up and make the changes that we need to make that will make them happen, because if we leave it to government, it will never happen. So, you want me to keep going?
Yeah.
I'm a principal, I can go on forever. So I look at this and I think the leadership matters, and that comes to all of us. You cannot hold young people to a higher standard than we're prepared to hold ourselves to. Now, whether I work in a single sex, I've worked in boys' schools, girls' schools, co-ed schools, honestly, the human heart is the same. The issue now is how do we lead out of this?
OK, Petria is a school girl. You're in, I think, year 11, is that right? 12. Year 12 in Sydney. Do you think Briony's squibbing it a bit on the boys' schools question? Do you think that there's an issue there?
I'd like to acknowledge that consent needs to be taught in all spheres of society, regardless of age, what school do you go to. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is the number of girls who've been assaulted by a boy who goes to a single-sex school exceeds the amount of fingers and toes that I have. And I think this is plausible evidence that there is an indoctrinating toxic culture in boys' schools. And I think it doesn't necessarily begin with the boys, but it begins with the environment that they're presented in. And I think it also starts from the fact that they don't have access to girls on a daily basis. They are with boys.
How do you think these boys see girls at your school, girls like you?
Honestly, I think we're seen as objects and as conquests. We're not people who you want to be friends with. It's simply, oh, who did you kiss on that night? Oh, who's that? You know, degrading women, using it as a topic of conversation to unite boys instead of actually wanting to be friends with them and more like form meaningful friendships. I feel like there's just a bit of, you know, a bit of divide there. And I have a brother who goes to a single-sex school, and I'm concerned that he's in a culture where he's exposed to that sort of behaviour and that sort of indoctrination where toxic masculinity is empowered instead of disempowered.
She's right, isn't she, Briony?
I'm not going to argue with anyone's opinion on that, and that's her experience. I get that, I really do. The challenge that I have is that when we did the Royal Commission into Institutionalised Child Abuse, we went, it's not everywhere. It's just in this pocket. It would never be in the church, you know, and, oh, look, it's in the church. And then you look at domestic violence and it would never be happening in the high SES, you know, wealthy families. And you go, oh, look at that, it's in wealthy families, you know. And I look at this and I go, yes, it has absolutely come to the surface through the independent schools and the single-sex schools, but we are delusional. It is willful blindness to think that it ends there. The Human Rights Commission have already done this through the army and they've found it rampant through there. They've done it in the hospitality industry. They've done it through there. It is a problem, and this doesn't actually lessen anything that you're saying, but I want to add to it and go, yes, I hear that, and if there's poor leadership in this area, you will absolutely see that behaviour.
Joe?
I've got to say I'm someone who went to an all-boys school from 7 to 10, and then I went to 11 and went to a co-ed school. And what we found is that boys couldn't integrate with girls in normal friendships, and to the point where we started actually having parties with just the boys, because we found it uncomfortable to talk to girls in any type of friendship type setting. Now, looking back at that, I thought it was completely normal at the time, but looking back, it's super toxic to the point where we can't have open and honest conversations with girls as mates. And you're right, you know, looking at how some boys' schools sit, you're looking at a guy who went to a boys' school, a guy who played in the NRL. A lot of the time, unfortunately, females are seen as objects. And it's super toxic, and that's the sort of stuff...
So where does it come from? You were in that environment. Where does that emerge from?
I think it's taught. I'm someone who now I do a lot of work specialising in people's behaviours, and every single person here tonight is a product of their own conditioning and their own upbringing. So the stuff that we see and how we act now as adults is stuff that we've been taught and stuff that we've been conditioned to believe is normal. So what we need to do is start to have these conversations with our boys at young ages. Talk about consent. Talk about respect before consent. About people and respecting people's views and you know, yes and no. And, you know, I talk to my 6-year-old boy now about respecting his 3-year-old sister. She stands over him, don't get me wrong, but at the end of the day, like I'm super grateful that my 2 daughters at the age of 3, almost 4, and 4, almost 14, almost 15, that they are fierce young girls, because I am super scared of the as we call it, toxic masculinity in society that we have. My girls will be able to stick up for themselves. I
want to get around the panel, but Patria, so you made the point that it's about boys' schools. Briony says this is a broader thing. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's just a particular brand of toxic masculinity that's coming out of these schools? Is that what you're saying?
Not necessarily, because I think that toxic masculinity is everywhere, whether you go to a boys' school or not. It's just an ingrained part of our culture, which is not good, of course, but it's just kind of the way it is, and hopefully we can change that. But I do think that when boys are with each other constantly, every day, for 7 hours, there's going to be some patterns that form, and there's going to be behaviours. And I think that, you know, of course, it's not all boys, but when you put boys together, it does rub off onto other boys. And we live in a society where peer pressure and staying silent is prevalent. And so what are boys supposed to do when that's the, you know, society that they're conditioned in?
I imagine you're talking about these consent issues amongst your school peers. Do you ever have those conversations with boys from the boys' schools?
Look, that conversation has been limited. I have tried, but boys do get very protective when speaking about this, and I think they perceive that we are attacking them, when really it should be diplomatic conversation where both parties are heard, and about integrating and hearing both perspectives while also making sure that women are empowered, because the fact of the matter is 1 in 5 women are sexually assaulted, which means that technically 1 in 5 men are the sexual assaulter. So there needs to be a conversation where both parties are heard, and to move forward to break a cycle that is clearly, you know, trapping us, and to like overcome that, I guess.
Patria Havardis. All right, let's take our next question. It comes from Emily Goodnow-Bewley.
As a survivor of sexual assault and a friend of all too many women who have been sexually assaulted, I fear that any effort we make to educate young girls, and importantly young boys, in school about consent will be overpowered by the growing access young people have to harmful pornographic content, which normalises domination, coercion and sexual violence. My question is, what role do schools have, and what plans are in place to combat this growing norm of harmful porn among young people?
Yumi.
Emily, I'm really sorry, and thank you for sharing that, and the question as well. I agree about porn. I think it's a really bad influence on a lot of people, and so much of what you see, I know there's a spectrum of porn, but there's also the mainstream porn that you can access on your phone very easily. So that's what I'm talking about and picturing in my mind when I'm talking about porn. You're right, it's choking and hair pulling, and that's like the vanilla stuff. It's really, really like over a line of what's acceptable. And I resent the idea that it's up to women in a heterosexual situation to police that and say, actually, no, that's not what we want. That's not actually appealing to us. And be the cop in that situation. I think that's really gross and uncool as well. So I think the conversation needs to be from men like Joe down through our cultures, talking to boys and not just girls, and saying, first of all, everything you see in porn, it's almost like what not to do in a sexual situation. Like, if you're doing what they do in porn, guaranteed someone is not enjoying that. And if people can really internalise that and go, oh, really? Well, then what is it? Because all the young people in our lives are seeing porn, and that is the only kind of sex they see, besides what they're doing themselves. So, of course, they're trying to imitate it, of course. So we need to be having those gross conversations where the kids go, Mum, please don't tell me about oral sex at dinner, or whatever. We need to be being really real about it. And, you know, there's so much fear about the conversations that we have with young people about sex that it's going to make them horny or something and make them want to go out and do it. And actually, the research shows the opposite. The more you talk about sex and be open and frank, the less they want to do it. So...
That's why you talk about it all the time.
Yeah, I'm not about it.
Michael, this is a question about schools, though. What's the role of schools in dealing with pornography?
Look, I mean, I think it's a bold conversation that needs to be had with young people. It's just an open conversation. We know that young people are accessing pornography. I mean, I want to go back to Briony's point about adults being adults and taking responsibility for this. We're in, you know, we have an online environment that is flooded with adult content that is easily accessible to young people. Has anyone made a decision that that is a good idea? It has just happened over the course of 20 years. And I think, you know, it's putting the onus on young people to change, or parents or schools, and actually ignoring, you know, frankly, the role of technology firms and companies in just providing this to young people on a platter. And, you know, that is a really serious problem, because it's not just the porn that kids are accessing. It's the fact that, you know, young people, adults, are now also making their own material, non-consensually sharing other people's material. There's all sorts of harms that's emerging in this environment. And the adults need to be adults. We need to start putting structures in place in the online environment.
You talking about legislation?
Yes, I am. And I'm talking about making decisions about what is good for kids to see or not, rather than just accepting that porn's going to be out there and we just have to deal with it. That's not inevitable.
Joe, do you talk about porn with young people?
I'll be honest, I haven't. You know, but again, it's something that I've sort of reflected on a lot this week. That obviously it's not my work that I do around that sort of stuff, but in talking with young people most days of the year.
But just explain the why not, because Yumi's saying, look, you know, it can be difficult to do that with your kids.
I'm happy to have the conversation with my kids. That's not an issue. They may not be happy to have the conversation with me, but I'm happy to have this conversation, and I'm about open and honest and frank conversations with all young people, especially with my kids. And again, it's about putting them on the right path to do and be the best that they can be. And I think, you know, porn and those sort of things, again, it gives this really false interpretation of what sex should be. Like, I remember, a bit of disclosure here, looking at it and going, hang on a minute, that's not what I do. So, like, it's a really false concept of what consensual sex looks like. Should we be having it with conversations with kids? You know, I got a 16-year-old boy. You know, these are conversations that I'm going to be starting to raise with him about that stuff ain't real. You don't need to look at that to interpret what sex is for you.
Yasmin?
Well, the thing is, schools can, of course, do a lot, but I can just imagine if they were to do that, what parents would say, hang on, I don't want my child to be taught about porn. I could just think of government saying, we don't want to fund that. That's a little bit too controversial. And that's the reality, because still it remains taboo. And in my opinion, we're totally underestimating how early young people are exposed to this. So at least half of young men under the age of 13 have already watched porn. So if this is somebody, let's say a young boy, who's alone and watching this, and this is the first time he's really engaged with sexual content and had never heard it from his school, from his parents, that's really problematic, because it's a for-profit industry that ultimately is relying on views and clicks, something that is male-centric, something that obviously doesn't focus on consent. So I think, just like Yumi was saying, yes, kids might roll their eyes or they might feel awkward, but even as a young person, I would have appreciated that conversation, even if I felt uncomfortable, because at least it was somebody that I trusted talking to me about it. And I think it's unrealistic to assume that young people don't watch it. And let's not have our kids learning about healthy sex through watching things online.
Briony, I think Yasmin's almost drafted the emails that are going to flood your inbox when you start teaching the Year 7s.
I'm just wondering how many parents are watching, because we actually we do this, right? Because it's girls, and so we want them to understand around the whole sexualised and how artificial this kind of world is. And by year 12, we are talking about porn and what it looks like and where it came from, where the roots of it came from. And so
you really are a school principal.
Yeah. What I find really interesting is that schools can do it, and we will be instantly constrained by parliamentarians who just go, you shouldn't even be talking about this. It's none of your business. Just teach them how to read and write. We can step over that. We can keep doing it. Ultimately, young people look to the adults around them for cues as to how to behave in situations where they don't have much experience. And sex is a great example of that. So they look around and I go, if you're not in their ear teaching them, somebody else is. So you've got to make a call about who is going to be educating your child. And if it's not you, then it's someone. And I can tell you, they look out there and they can see the ex-president of the United States who says he can grab a woman wherever, whenever he wants, wherever he wants, and she will have no say in that. And you look at how, women here finally get together to march around things, and we're meant to be grateful that we weren't shot. And I'm like, they're looking for this about, well, where are the cues around how you behave? And I can tell you, we as a society have to work this out.
OK, I want to take our next question on that note. It's from Anna Jenica Burkwood.
Hi. After the March for Justice protest, the Prime Minister said that protesters not being met with bullets is a triumph for democracy. Do you agree?
So they weren't exactly his words, but I think we all understand the point. Yasmin, do you agree with the Prime Minister's message?
Actually, I think it's a fundamental flaw in our democracy if young women can't go to Parliament and not be raped. I think that's a fundamental, and be raped, that's a fundamental actual problem in our democracy. So I'm not thankful for not being shot. I'm furious. I am angry that any young woman that desires or aspires to go into politics now will have to think twice. That is appalling, and that is a shame on our democracy. So to think that the Prime Minister couldn't have the backbone to even get out there and speak to all the protesters, thousands of women wearing black in mourning, to think that he could hide away in his office and then make those kind of statements is something that sits so wrong with me, because my work, the majority of my work has been encouraging young women to put their hands up and run. And for the first time, I had to think, will they be safe? Will they be safe in 2021 in Australia? Will their bodies and bodily autonomy be respected?
You were at the rally in Canberra. You obviously maybe have some political aspirations. What did you think? What did you think looking at the building that you were once so excited to go and visit as a schoolgirl?
Right, yeah. I remember when I was 12 and I went on my first school trip to Parliament, and I looked at it in awe. And I thought, these are the highest leaders in Australia. Look at the change that we can make. And I felt the weight of change inside of me. And yet that time, we were marching, again, side by side with women wearing black, mourning the stories of Briony, the stories of the women that stepped forward, some that even are not around to tell their story now. So to me, it was a big marker of this endemic culture of violent misogyny, even in the highest political institution, that has existed not just right now, for generations, perhaps even since the beginning of Parliament. So I think I'm continuing to encourage young women. We need that critical mass at the end of the day. We need women to be heard. But what does it say when we're fearing, whether women will even be treated and kept safe? That's insane to think about, but it's the reality.
Joe.
I don't think for 1 minute we should be shocked to hear certain comments. When this country, going to be confronting words here, but this country was founded on this sort of stuff. With the raping and bashing of black and brown women for a couple of centuries. So and that comes from the highest establishment of what we call Australia. We need to demand better when it comes to this sort of stuff. We can't be surprised. As I said, it's been happening, and Aboriginal women have been calling this sort of stuff for many, many years. We need to start to listen and collectively as a country do better. I can't help but think, and just sitting here and hearing the different questions and even responses, a lot of it has been centred around what the victim should do. We need to stop men raping women. Not what victims should be doing in this sort of situation. We need to empower and encourage and support victims to all ends, but we need to stop men from doing the wrong things.
And can I just add with this story of everything that's been happening in Parliament, the one person that no longer works in Parliament is Briony Higgins. Why on earth has no politician that was involved in this been fired or had to leave? I mean, that's, again, that example of one brave woman stepping forward, and you see how those in power close ranks. The lying cow comment, the looking into the background of her partner, even this comment about trial by media. You know, these are all putting the onus back on survivors and punishing survivors. So just like you said, it's demanding accountability, and that's something we're not seeing.
Though? The question about why would somebody like Saxon Mullins, Briony Higgins, the deceased woman who accused the Attorney General, Grace Tame, why would they report? Why, when it's so thankless and horrible? Because, Saxon, when I saw you step up and tell your story on national television that was so raw and harrowing and painful to you, what you did was you lit a fire in me. And I felt it go through my sisters, through our mothers, through women all over the country, and we're on fire now, and we're thankful to you. So you didn't get the court justice that you wanted, but we're going to keep fighting, and we're not going to give up.
So, on that note, please thank our panel, our wonderful panel. Yumi Stynes, Michael Salter, Briony Scott, Joe Williams and Yasmin Poole. Please thank all. And you can save your biggest round of applause for Saxon Mullins and the wonderful people in the audience who've asked questions and shared stories tonight. Thank you. Next week, we're in Melbourne, asking how we can design a better, more equal world when it comes to gender, to race and to wealth. We're bringing together a panel of big and bold thinkers, including the author Bruce Pascoe, the broadcaster Stan Grant, economist Thomas Piketty and Gigi Foster, and journalist Adam Crichton. We'll see you then. Good night.